Welcome to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Haun. And with me today is Kelly Greenhill, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and a fellow alum of the MIT SSP program. Kelly, welcome to Advice for Grad Students, and let's get right into it. Outside and non-traditional funding sources, what advice do you have to grad students?
Thanks, Phil. I'm delighted to be back with you again. What advice do I have? In terms of funding, I would say, this will be a bit of a truism, but apply early and apply often. I say apply early and apply often because, several reasons. We can all use funding to do our research, and sometimes we require it in order to be able to do our research. It also often takes quite some time between when one has applied for funding, when one hears about funding, and when the funding becomes available. It also is the case that even if one could afford to fund one's own research, though that can be ambitious and sporting, it looks great on one's CV if one has managed to get funding. I would also say there's something to be said for the biggest predictor for getting funding is that you've had funding. So there's a million reasons to apply for funding, but again, it can take quite some time. It's also not a guarantee. So apply early, apply often, because people can be quite lucky, but they may not be. And even if one is quite lucky, one's probably not going to get all of the funding one applies for. Try not to take the setbacks or the no's personally. It's a numbers game. Quite often, many people are applying for the same funding sources, and one thing over which one has zero control is who else is applying in a given funding cycle. And so, your project could be awesome, and last year it would have been funded, and next year it will be funded, but it's not going to be funded the year you're applying. So apply early, apply often. In terms of non-traditional funding sources, I would say the same thing holds. Apply early and apply often. If you can tell a good story, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but if your project fits within the remit of an unexpected or a different funding source, like for instance, political scientists sometimes are doing projects that are eligible for National Endowment for the Humanities funding, apply. Now make sure that you tell a good story. Like I said, have a reasonable rationale for why you're applying for what might be non-traditional sources. But if you have a good story, go for it. And every time one spends time crafting one of these applications or thinking about how one's research speaks to different audiences, one also has the salutary additional benefit of figuring out for oneself how and why one's research is applicable and possibly of interest to audiences outside of the traditional political science realm. So, even if one never gets any of this funding, there are all sorts of positive externalities associated with going after these funding sources. Sometimes also doing the research to figure out where to apply for funding can give one new research ideas for future projects, but it can also serve as a source of information about other people who are playing in a similar research pond as oneself, that maybe one wouldn't have encountered these people's work if not for doing the research associated with looking for funding. So there are a whole host of reasons to apply early, apply often, both to the traditional set of sources, but also well outside of them. One other thing I would say is, one is extraordinarily lucky. One sometimes get one's research funded by international organizations or transnational organizations who want answers to the same questions that you do. So I've been lucky on a few occasions to have my research, if you will, funded by someone else who was doing some related research anyway, and was able to get survey questions that I was interested in inserted into surveys that were being fielded by other entities because they too were curious about the answers, but it cost me a lot of time in terms of IRB and time in terms of going to field sites and so on, but a whole lot less than it would have had I had to, say, field the survey myself. And I learned a whole lot more from the questions that the international organizations were posing themselves.
Okay, let's get tactical right now on the
I'm sorry, what did you say?
tactical. Let's get at the
Tactical, yeah.
tactical level and advice on how to actually improve, or what are the steps involved to make a good pitch for funding?
The steps involved, I would say, go visit the websites or the materials, pore over the materials that are provided by funders. Quite often they spend an enormous amount of time thinking long and hard about what sorts of things they want to fund. And so when they're telling you what they're looking for, you should listen to them. Sometimes one can talk to program managers to gather more data. It's also worth doing some research to find out if one knows anyone who's been successful at getting funding from X, Y, or Z entity, and asking them, do you have tips you can provide? Or, if you were unsuccessful, did you get feedback about, some do's and potentially don'ts for others who are going to apply? So I would say, this is part and parcel of the do one's research, but, I would say take advantage of one's own knowledge networks, but also spend time, as I said, looking at the information that is provided by funders. And if you have questions, like sometimes also, even though these funders spend an enormous amount of time and energy providing this material, sometimes the information provided is vague, and one can't tell if it's deliberately vague or it's intentionally vague to allow for a broad array of applications or applicants. So this is where, as I said, sometimes reaching out to the program manager and inquiring, so where you say X, I could interpret that to mean P or Q. Is it P or Q, or is it P or is it Q? Just so that I know that either this is a source that I should pursue, or it's a source I shouldn't pursue, or I should think about how to craft my proposal to show why I am trying to do what you're looking to fund.
Okay, so you may not have thought about this. I'm going to turn this around. So you've been successful in getting funding. Most grad students are really concerned about getting the funding. So what happens when you catch the car, right? When the dog gets the bumper, what are some of the challenges associated once you actually gain this funding?
It's an excellent question to which I don't have a particularly good answer, other than to say, if you look at the interviews that you've not given, interviews you've
I've already
hosted,
done.
you've done on field work or
Yes.
on conducting research, all of that stuff comes into play. So if one's lucky enough to get the funding, like, be careful what you ask for, because all of that other stuff become live issues. In terms of there being problems associated with getting, or once one gets the funding per se, I can't, like I said, it's a really good question, and maybe I'm just suffering from a failure of imagination. Other than the obvious problem in fieldwork, whereby what if you can't get the information or you can't do the research that you told the funder you were going to do? That can be a problem. So yeah, then I would say it's really incumbent upon the researcher to reach out to the funder and say, whoa, plan A didn't work out, so I'm pursuing plan B. Is that okay? And I guess as I'm talking out loud here, I do have an answer for you, because I was extraordinarily lucky to be rewarded a Lever Home visiting professorship that I was supposed to spend in London for a year. And then there was this little thing called COVID that hit. And so I then engaged in some kind of time travel whereby I was in London while being in Boston remotely, which was like a neat trick. But the Lever Home Trust was extraordinarily understanding and flexible in terms of allowing me to be in Boston while in London, and then extended me for a second year when I was actually able to travel for some amount of time to London. I wasn't able to postpone my fellowship because I had agreed to take on additional duties at the start of the year, the follow-on year. So this is too much in the weeds, but I would say the short answer to the question is be in touch with the funder, be upfront, be straightforward about the situation, and, ask them, is this going to be a problem? Can we go with plan B? If not, should I relinquish the funding? Should I not take the funding? I can't speak for funders across the board, but in the cases where I've had to pivot and have been in touch with the funders, they've all been extraordinarily flexible. And as long as one's producing output,
Yes.
There's no downside, I think, for the funder.
So I think you're one of those type of academics that actually gets the funding and then executes. I unfortunately have had to deal with some academics who have gotten the funding, and then research equals funding plus time and a good plan. And sometimes those don't all come together at the right time. So that was the reason for that last question. But anyway, do you have anything else? Because we're about out of time.
Let's see. I would say, I guess one other thing that researchers can do is in soliciting their knowledge networks is ask other people, like, well, this is my project. Who would you, where would you seek funding? So even before one gets to, oh, I see you've been successfully funded by X, what advice can you give me? Talk to people, smart people, and see if maybe they surface, conversations can surface ideas that one hasn't thought of. And the additional upside of that is sometimes one ends up with a better research design and a better set of research questions just by having these conversations. And so this is a very narrow way to say something much broader, which is use your cohort, so ask fellow graduate students, use your advisors, use other faculty, use, folks that you meet at conferences, talk about your work. Don't give away the family jewels, but to the extent that we can all learn from each other and do better work by interacting with people and seeking advice about projects. And sometimes you find out, oh, there's someone else working on a tangential project. This sort of, I just say, I would encourage more academic exchange and more communication. And I know this is harder, now that we're in the not post-COVID, but we're no longer in the before times. But to the extent that one can engage in more communications and networking this way, I think all sorts of really interesting and good things come out of this. And to go to another interview I gave with you, some interesting collaborations and co-authorship, projects have come out of these kinds of exchanges, and one can get a sense of is one simpatico with X person or Y person in having these kind of communications and figuring out whether one's brains fire and the juices start flowing. So
I think you're
talk early, talk often, in addition to apply early, apply often.
So I think that's great advice. Show humility, ask questions. You're not really bugging a mentor because so few people come and ask for that kind of advice. By all means, do so. Well, that's all the time we have today.
I would say one thing: don't go to your advisor and say, "How can you get me this funding?"
Yeah. You don't
really
go for advice. Don't go.
Can you talk to me about funding?
That's a good
advisors
point.
can't get people. Well, maybe they can. I don't think they can, but they can help one put one's best foot forward.
That's right. You should learn how to fish, not ask for a fish.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Anyway, that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Kelly, for joining us on Advice for Grad Students.
Thank you, Phil.